Welcome to another episode of Defending the Line. I'm Christy Shepard, and this is my podcast to share the story of what happened in the murder of my cousin Debbie Carter in our small Oklahoma town, and how finding out the men convicted of that crime were innocent turned into a quest for truth and accountability. At this point, it had been more than 2 decades since Debbie had been murdered. I began to have this very strong drive to find out more about her case, because I really felt like Peppy and the rest of my family deserved to know the truth. I just wasn't sure where to find that truth. I mean, the defense attorneys, for Williamson and Fritz, they couldn't share that information with me. And I didn't feel comfortable at all talking to the police or the prosecution, because I didn't know where that truth lied with them. And so I felt like maybe a good place to start was to go back and look at the newspaper articles of the time. And that's when I learned that, as far as the archives as a whole, that between 1978 and 1988, all the archives for the newspaper articles were missing. But when I called the newspaper office. I spoke to a lady who was the editor at the time. Her name was Brenda. And I explained who I was and my, connection to Debbie. And she was really sweet and helpful, because she had put everything in one box from when John Grisham had come to look at everything a few, months prior. And so I went to the newspaper office. There was this, large cardboard box that she set up on the table, and she took the lid off of it and, welcomed me to look through it and spend as much time as I needed, and to ask if I had any questions. And she closed the door and, left me to myself just to kind of look through things. And I really remember feeling so uneasy. I mean, obviously I knew what the outcome was, but with every article I unfolded, it was like, I don't know, just disarming a bomb. Like I didn't really know what it would say or what would be there. One after another, there was Williamson, Fritz, Gore, Peterson, trial, murder, just on and on and on. And when Debbie was mentioned, she was reduced to barmaid, bartender, waitress at a bar. And it seemed there was always this implication of her employment, or even really Debbie herself, somehow contributed to her own death. Kind of a unconscious wink that, this is what happens to girls who hang out in bars. And I pretty much got lost just reading and taking notes and recording dates and, trying to put things in some kind of timeline order, along with, the just my own memory of dates and, when things came. And I came toward the end of the box, and there was actually like a stack of paper that it wasn't a newspaper, it was like printer paper. And I thought at first maybe it was an accident that it was there. But on the front page of this paper, it said stamped, it said copied, filed February 28th of 2002. And it says transcript of proceedings hearing on motions for summary judgment. The plaintiffs were listed as Dennis Fritz, Ronald Williamson, by and through his legal guardian, Annette Hudson, and Elizabeth Fritz. And defendants were the city of Ada, Oklahoma. And the first several, pages, they were just documenting, the lawyers going back and forth, with the judge on why the case should or shouldn't be dismissed. And then the judge begins to ask questions. And the lawyers began to discuss exculpatory evidence and Brady violations, both of which I would have to go home and Google what those meant. But I noticed right off, my attention was drawn to a name that I had never seen before. And it was a friend of Debbie's. I'm not going to say her name. But it stated that in an affidavit in this document that Debbie and her friend had gone to see Detective Smith with some concerns that Debbie had, and that she went to Detective Smith with these concerns because of her relationship with him, that she had known him for so long. This friend explains that Debbie had gone to Detective Smith to tell him about an argument that she had with Glenn Gore about a week before she was murdered. And this friend stated that she drove Debbie to a little town that's about 15-20 minutes from Ada to confront Gore about vandalizing the windshield wipers of her car. That when Debbie came out of this house that they'd gone to, where she went to talk to Gore, that she was even more convinced that he was the one that was responsible for vandalizing her car, and that she was afraid of him. And the attorney continued on that there's no documentation of this report from the friend and Debbie to Detective Smith in the file anywhere. It goes on that there were actually 23 people who were identified at the Coach Light on December the 7th of 1982, but only 15 were interviewed, and 8 of those were never turned over, and that no one else in the bar that night ever mentions Williamson being there except Gore, but he doesn't do it even for years later. So I remember pretty much for looking through this stuff, I was standing, taking things out of the box. But I came across a part of this that I really had to take a seat once I'd read it once. At the top of this page, it says, Mr. Peters, Mr. Peters was a OSBI analyst. So it says Mr. Peters' original report that this palm print does not match Debbie Sue Carter. Undisputably an exclusion. He writes a report saying this is an exclusion. I flipped to the previous page and I flipped back, trying to get clarity on what I was reading. And it continues on that it states, "We certainly have an expert that says so, that this is fabricated evidence." I couldn't wrap my mind around it. I mean, this was all about what exhuming her body was about. Was we had been told that they couldn't rule her out. They needed to know if it was or wasn't her handprint because they didn't get good handprints. But in this document, it clearly states that Peters was unable to identify the source of the print, but excluded Williamson, Fritz, and Debbie. She was excluded in the original report. Not that they didn't know. And so I spent the better part of the day there at the newspaper office reading through these pages and flipping back and forth, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And I eventually began to just kind of scan the pages, and words and names would pop out, kind of like, when you see a word search. And some of the names I recognized, but I couldn't reconcile within myself how they had anything to do with Debbie's case. Like, I didn't know how any of this fit. And one of the names that I recognized was a former assistant chief of police, a man by the name of Dennis Corbin. I didn't know Dennis. I knew who he was, but I had never been around him. I didn't know him. But he's actually the brother of my husband's stepmom. I'd never seen anything having anything to do with, him. I didn't understand the connection. I read through the testimony. It basically alleged that Gore was dealing dope for this Dennis Corbin, and that it was likely the reason that Gore had been set aside as a suspect in Debbie's murder. And I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to think about any of this. And I remember driving home so confused and so angry that this original report actually stated, that wasn't Debbie's handprint. I was enraged at the thought of the fact that maybe they didn't just make a mistake, that they deliberately overlooked Gore. And I was heartbroken as to how I was going to explain this to Peppy and to my mom and to the rest of my family. I mean, where do you even begin with something like that? What do you say? Again, I was really confused on the timeline with Dennis Corbin, because I remember, that he'd been arrested, but that had been years later after Debbie was murdered. And so I began to look online and try to figure out, timing of when all this took place. And I ran across an article that stated that Corbin had been investigated by the DA's Drug Task Force, the OSBI, the Ada Police Department, the Pontotoc County Sheriff's Office, and that during this investigation, of another suspect, and through a confidential informant, they had found out about Mr. Corbin, and he was charged with conspiracy to manufacturing methamphetamine, 2 counts of distribution of methamphetamine, possession of a controlled dangerous substance. And all these charges were within 2,000 feet of a school and maintaining a dwelling resorted to users of drugs. But the date was February of 2001 that this all happened. And though apparently it wasn't a secret that Mr. Corbin was involved in these things, but it seems timely that he took early retirement from the police department, and within just a few months was then arrested and charged with all these things. Nick Corbin, he pleads a deal, there's no trial, and he disappears into federal court or to federal prison out of state. And then it comes out that Gore was dealing for him, or allegedly that he was. And I was really angry, but I tried not to let that cloud trying to honor Debbie and her memory, and and I wanted something that would bear her name and represented her fiery spirit, radiate the love that her family had for her, something that would also change things, and maybe another family would not go through what our family had. And so I had set my mind on beginning an Oklahoma Innocence Commission. The executive director of the Innocence Project, Maddie DeLone, who I spoke about earlier, she had introduced me to a victim advocate, and they had done this in her state. And the concept of an Innocence Commission is to review cases in which there is a wrongful conviction, not in terms of pointing the finger and finding blame, but to understand what happened so that we can hopefully make those changes so that it doesn't happen again. And the way that it was drafted was that it wouldn't cost anything, that it was a voluntary commission, and that different stakeholders from, the governor to the Attorney General's office, that, they got to pick representatives of this commission. And I was really hell-bent on it being law. I wanted it to be a law. I wanted it to bear her name. Maddie put me in contact with a gentleman by the name of Stephen Saloom, who was the policy director there at the Innocence Project. And he's this really enthusiastic guy, and he was more than willing to answer my questions, and he was very helpful. And I'll admit, at the beginning, I was rather suspicious of him, feeling like, why is he so eager to help me, and what is in this for him? And really, we probably talked every week. And for a long time, I kept my distance, and I think he probably could sense that to some degree. But he really helped me to understand the language and the complexity of filing a bill in the state legislature. Helped me to just understand criminal justice as far as policy and law is concerned. But before I got too far into this and, wanting to try to get this legislation passed, I knew that there were phone calls that I needed to make because it really felt hypocritical to me to advocate for such a commission for reviewing cases where there had been people found innocent and not personally reach out to the men found innocent in Debbie's case. And since, Ron Williamson had died the previous year, I decided to reach out to his sister Annette. I had remembered that, she was grateful, when Peppy called when Ron passed away. But I was really nervous that she might not be happy to hear from me. I'd never met Ron's older sister. And I'd seen, I remember seeing quotes that she had in the paper where she, had always claimed her brother's innocence. I remember feeling, angry at how they always quoted her. And though I'd never really, met Annette, I'd actually gone to high school with her son, and we were friends. And because her son, didn't have the same last name as Ron, I had no idea that was, that my friend was Ron Williamson's nephew. And so anyway, I called Annette and explained who I was and that I had gone to high school with her son. She was very gracious and sweet. And I explained to her that I knew that, my aunt had called them when Ron passed away. I know that my words probably seemed very, measured, and I could still hear the crack in my voice, trying not to cry. And she said, I really appreciate that you called and that it's very sweet. And I could tell she was, a little guarded. But I explained to her that after the Court TV interview, how my family's, what we knew to be the truth had really completely disappeared. And then it felt like it just continued to slip away with every little thing that came up. And we talked about Ron's mental health issues and how sick he was when he left death row. And I explained to her about, wanting to do this legislation and create this commission. She offered to help in any way that she could. And I also expressed to her my desire and my apprehension about contacting Dennis Fritz. She explained that she thought he would be fine with hearing from me. But I wasn't sure if only being fine with it was something I was real comfortable with. But before we hung up, she said, I really think you should talk to John Grisham. Because at this time, John was very involved with Ron's sisters in gathering his story. Annette explained that she thought that Mr. Grisham would want to hear from me. how it had come about that Mr. Grisham even came upon Ron's story was that Grisham was reading the obituaries in the New York Times, and a journalist by the name of Jim Dyer wrote Ron's obituary, and that's where Grisham saw it. And he really felt this kinship with learning about Ron being a promising baseball player. They had similar upbringings and from small town and religious upbringing and things. He wanted to write this true legal thriller. And I gave it a lot of thought, and I knew that author of Grisham's caliber would shine a spotlight on the heart of this catastrophe. But I had no idea what he would say about Debbie. He certainly, even though the book wasn't about Debbie, he certainly couldn't tell the story of Ron Williamson and not tell a portion of Debbie's. So I wanted whatever Grisham wrote about Debbie to come from us. I had kept the number that Annette gave me for probably a couple of weeks. And finally one evening I just decided I'll just call and get it over with. I mean, I didn't know what the reaction would be. But no one answered, and so I just left kind of this rambling message about who I was, and I was from Ada, and I was a cousin of the victim in Ron's case, and that Annette had given me the number, and thank you, bye. And I thought to myself, after all that fretting about what I would say, and I just had to leave a voicemail, and it wasn't even John Grisham's number. It was like an assistant or something. And I don't think that I had probably barely put down my phone when that same number called me right back. And in fact, it was someone who was doing, research for Grisham's book. And he says, I got your message and this is great. And I'm sure John is going to want to talk to you. And I ended up talking to this guy for probably an hour and tried to kind of give him the short version of my point of view. And I told him, I said, there's all these missing pieces. And we hold part of the story that no one knows because no one has ever asked. And I began to tell him, like, did you know that she only lived there for 60 days? I told him about a story about how about a month before Debbie had been murdered, that her old boyfriend, who I believe she might have even dated in high school, he had come to her apartment. And the reason that I even know this story is because Debbie's younger sister had spent the night with her this evening that he came to her house. That he left sometime early in the morning. What she remembered so clearly about him being there and leaving, or sometime like still when it was dark, that he left out, and when he got down to his car that was parked there on the street, that there was one of those tall metal parking meters that they used to have, like, downtown places, that there was one of those parking meters through the back glass of his car. Someone had thrown it through his car. The guy kind of gasped, and I'm like, yeah, So someone was watching her. Someone knew that the guy that she dated off and on for a while, someone knew that he was there, and they obviously didn't like it. That Debbie, shortly before her death, had started dating someone new, and that he was actually supposed to be back in Oklahoma the day that she was found murdered. And so someone got to her before he got back in town. And I could tell that this gentleman was taking notes. Again, just describing some of this and telling him about it just seemed to kind of add to the craziness. I guess it was in preparation for around about the same time I was trying to work on this commission and hopefully file this in the legislature with Debbie's bill. I was also helping Peppy to get ready for court for the 4th time. I called the assistant district attorney and explained that I really felt like it was important for Peppy to be prepared for court this time. In that, lawyers are prepared for what they're going to present and talk about, and so I really felt like it was important for her to be just as prepared. And so I called the assistant DA and explained all this to him, and I was very pleasant, even though I always had in mind his comments about, when Ron and Dennis were exonerated. But I put all that aside and felt like it would be beneficial to Peppy if we talked to him, and he agreed. He thought that it was a really good idea to have her prepared, and just so she didn't have to deal with any surprises. So he thought that was a good idea. And he told me that, he would let me know closer to going to trial that, she would get brought in and we would have this conversation. And as we got closer to the trial, I never heard back from him. And so one evening, or I guess, before 5, I called his office, and one of the receptionists there, who was actually a friend of my mom's, answered the phone. I explained to her that I had talked to Mr. Ross before and that it was getting closer to trial, and I thought he was going to call and we were going to have these meetings, and I just hadn't heard from him. And so she put me on hold, and I was on hold for quite some time. Instead of him getting on the phone, the receptionist gets back on the phone, and you could tell she really did not want to say to me what he had said. But she says, Christy, Chris says that if your aunt wants a meeting, she's going to have to call and get that herself. And it was as if they had poured hot water over my head. I was so mad, and I just said, well, you might let him know that she hasn't called for a meeting in 30 years, and she probably won't call this time either. it was my thoughts that he had probably found out about the legislation that I was trying to file, and maybe wasn't very happy. But with all of this and trying to get ready for court, I knew that there was one phone call that I had left to make before I felt comfortable to try to file the legislation and to talk to, my senator and representatives. And so again, I stared at the little yellow post-it note that I'd taken down the numbers from Ron's sister. I knew it was time to call Dennis Fritz. But what do you say to someone that you've wished horrible things on? What do you say to someone you've been afraid of your whole life? What do you start that conversation? I mean, I don't know that I'm sorry or I was wrong is nearly enough. But it's the only place I had to start. So I decided to just get it over with and give Dennis a call. And I didn't know how he would react to me, and I think I probably wore the rug in my office out from pacing back and forth on it. And I remember when he said hello, it was almost though he answered like he was prepared for something. So I'm sure it said, the caller ID said my name. And when I heard his voice, I kind of froze. And I couldn't hardly get the words to come out. And I was telling him, I said, Mr. Fritz, this is Christy Shepard and the cousin Debbie Carter. And I want you to know that we know that you didn't kill her. And that we are so sorry for what you went through. And my voice cracked and my chin began to quiver. And I was trying to not make such loud, deep breaths. And I waited for his response because I didn't know if he would cuss me out or hang up on me or what he would do. And I didn't blame him if he lashed out. But he said, Chrissy, you don't know how much this means to me to hear from you. And he thanked me. And you could tell he was trying not to cry as well. And Dennis's humble thank you was probably even harder to hear than if he had cussed me out. And I said, please don't thank me. And you don't owe us anything. And he just said, I'm so sorry for what happened to Debbie and for what happened to your family and what you've been through. While his gratitude and his empathy was appreciated, it, to some degree, made it harder. It would have just been easier if he was angry and yelled at me. And we probably talked on the phone for more than 2 hours. I was really enthralled with how this clarity played out from his viewpoint as he was with, my viewpoint and from my family's perspective. And I had a million questions, and so did he. And as we wrapped up our conversation, he said he had one question that he just had to ask, but that he was hesitant about. And he said, back when we were exonerated, we heard that Debbie's family hired the KKK to put a hit out on me and Ronnie. He said, is that true? And I was like, what? Oh my gosh, no. Like, that's the most ridiculous. Like, I just thought that was silly. I told him, I said, I'd never heard that. I'd never even heard a whisper of that in my family. And I told him, I said, honestly, I could have seen my family being the ones who were more likely to do something themselves and hiring it out. But I just thought that was just crazy talk. But that part was behind me. Then it was time to move on to court and to move on to hopefully getting this bill passed in Debbie's name. So in the next episode, we'll talk about the discoveries made, more of the discoveries made in the civil suit filed by Williamson and Fritz, and how the beginning of friendships that I'd made would change my life. So again, feel free to send your questions, and I will do my best to answer them in a follow-up episode, and you can send those to defendingtheline@gmail.com. And you can go to defendingtheline.com for other information, updates, as well as Defending the Line on Instagram. You can also watch these episodes on YouTube at Defending the Line. And I thank you for listening.